everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. I'm flying solo again, so it's Murray's Ancient Warfare Answers, your 10-minute Ancient Warfare fix for the week. We have a question from Ľuboš coming up in a minute. You can ask us a question. You can send us an email. You can send us a message. You can write us a letter, postcard, however you like. You can also, of course, support the podcast on Patreon. Just go to www.patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast, and you can back us up in 3 different ways. Lovely. Now, the question we have is about cavalry charges. Ľuboš asks, how can we imagine cavalry battles and mostly charges? We hear that, for example, Alexander charged with his companions into enemy formations. I ask that because stirrups were not invented, and I presume that the stability of the horse rider would not be very stable, so I wouldn't expect the charges like the knights in the medieval ages. And also, how, for example, did the charge of light cavalry look? For example, the Numidians, they had very little or no armor. Did they dismount? So the first thing to establish, of course, is that the ancient saddles, whether it be the 4-horn saddle or the 2-horn saddle that we have from the Near East that survive, do allow experienced cavalry riders to charge home. That you can lean into one of those horns and you will be held on to the back of the horse, even without stirrups. So charging home is something that an experienced horse rider can do even without stirrups. Would they need to charge home? This is the question. And when we think of charging home, of course, we're thinking of heavy cavalry charging a perceivably solid wall, which horses tend not to do unless they're very well trained. And, you know, again, you find it talked about for the Battle of Waterloo that the French cavalry refused to charge the squares of the British infantry because they perceived them to be solid. And the interesting thing, of course, is that most cavalry in the ancient world aren't charging solid lines of enemy infantry. They are charging the rear of enemy infantry, or they are charging broken formations of enemy infantry that are already fleeing the field and they're being cut down. So the charge is not necessarily into a solid formation. And even in Alexander's battles, which we'll get onto in a little bit of detail in a minute, you're probably not dealing with a solid charge into a formation that's fully formed. What you've got in most cavalry battles prior to the age of the Alexandrian companions is missile cavalry that will harass, fire archery or javelins from a distance to break up formations, and then wait for the infantry to do their job, and then presumably you will win the battle, the enemy will break and flee, and your cavalry will then chase them down. Again, firing missiles, but also charging and cutting them down from behind because they're not aiming to defend themselves. So cavalry are generally involved in that kind of fighting. There are, of course, hemippoi, which we've talked about before, where you've got people who ride to battle, dismount, fight as infantry, and then remount. And even in later phases of warfare. So, for instance, at the Battle of Delium, we have some anecdotes that talk about Xenophon and Socrates losing their horse. Now, we know that Socrates fights as a hoplite rather than as a cavalryman, and Xenophon, we think, fights as a cavalryman, but we're told that he fights as a hoplite at that battle. And so whether, if it's inaccurate, you know, did they ride to battle and then dismount? We don't know. Same with Alcibiades. There's the idea that he's on a horseback at the Battle of Delium rather than as an infantryman. Now, what you then get, of course, is the idea that cavalry, therefore, are charging, but they're not charging fully formed infantry formations. They're generally on the wings and they're harassing or pursuing defeated enemies. Now, the battles of Alexander, one of the interesting things about the battles of Alexander is that when you start to look at the formation of Alexander's battles, you have the idea that in the center of his line is his phalanx, which we spoke about in just the previous podcast. That's a solid block of 9,000 men. And it holds the center, generally speaking, in nearly all of Alexander's battles. Alexander posts himself and the companions on the right flank of his phalanx. So you normally have the phalanx, then you have the hypaspists. Now, the hypaspists are a double strength taxis of phalangites. So they're similarly armed to the phalanx, but there's 3,000 of them in a single taxis. And next to them is the companion cavalry. Now, generally speaking, what Alexander does is, as soon as the battle starts, he moves his cavalry to the right. And what seems to happen at the Battle of Issus and Gaugamela especially is that when he moves to the right, the Persians counter that move, and they generally outnumber him, and they move to the left to mirror his march to the right. And at some point in the battle, having moved to the right, Alexander then turns and charges into a gap towards Darius in both cases. So Darius is probably in the center. That's where the Persian king tended to be stationed behind the immortals or the apple bearers, depending on which source you're following. And so if that's the case, again, Alexander's probably not charging into a solid mass of enemy infantry or cavalry. He's charging into a disrupted formation that he's created by making them move to the left to mirror and shadow his move to the right. So therefore, if you've got the phalanx and Alexander's here, he moves this way, the enemy mirror him, leaving a gap, and he charges that gap. And again, one of the things that Alexander does, whenever he charges that gap with the companions, he always takes either a taxis of the phalanx or the hypaspists with him. So that's always a cavalry charge supported by infantry. So he's not charging alone. At the Battle of the Granicus, one of our sources tells us that as soon as he arrives, he charges his cavalry across the river and wins. But then there's another version that he waits till the morning, and again, the infantry are the solid anchor, and he moves to the right and he charges into the gap. So it seems to be that trick is something that Alexander does in those major battles, that he's doing the same thing. And you can argue, even though there's less evidence for it, that that's exactly what happens at the Battle of Chaeronea as well. And so it's almost as if the tactics that Alexander will undertake in Asia are things that he's already learned from his father in Greece. And so he's not charging a solid enemy formation. He's charging a disrupted enemy formation, and he can therefore take advantage of that. His horses won't shy, and they will charge into the gap, and he will wreak havoc, as indeed he does. So in that regard, you've got cavalry which are not heavy cavalry. They are missile cavalry, and therefore they are involved in harassing enemy formations and other cavalry formations with archery or javelins. And then you've got heavy cavalry that do charge home, but generally speaking, they're not charging home into solid formations. They're charging home into disrupted formations, whether it be of infantry or fellow cavalry. So I hope that answers your question, Ľuboš.